Welcome, everyone, to the webinar Advancing the Rights of Antarctica. My name is Natalia Green. I am the Global Director of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and the Secretariat of the International Rights of Nature Tribunal. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to this webinar and to welcome you to this amazing space of advancing the rights of Antarctica. This webinar is organized by the Antarctic Rights, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, Biodiversity Funders Group, and with the support of Environment Now. It is our pleasure to be presenting this amazing group of people and to be speaking today about Antarctica rights. I would just like to give a short introduction about Antarctica. Since Antarctica, including the surrounding ocean, Southern Ocean, plays a vital role in enabling life worldwide to flourish. The Antarctica Treaty System, ATS, reserved Antarctica for peaceful purposes and has promoted scientific collaboration since 1959. But this magnificent vast wilderness now faces grave threats from political and resource interests and from climate change. Over 1,000 Antarctica experts issued a letter at the COP29 climate talks describing the unprecedented melting with cascading and several global climate impacts. In this context, a draft Antarctica Declaration has been prepared that recognizes the rights of Antarctica on all of its beings and humanity's responsibility to respect those rights. The declaration is not intended to replace the ATS. Rather, Antarctica's unique international governance approach opens the door for ambitious action to achieve a collective vision of a flourishing Antarctica, supporting a thriving for ambitious action to achieve supporting a thriving planet. The proposed declaration will similarly align with advance other commitments, including global climate commitments and the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The declaration has most recently been reflected in the Antarctica Rights Motion, being considered by the IUCN for its quadrennial meeting later this year. The Antarctic Rights Movement joins an accelerating rights of nature movement worldwide, transforming how humans relate to the natural world. The success of international climate and ecological initiatives depend on effective safeguards for beautiful, wild, but threatened Antarctica, both for its role in regulating world climate and its own intrinsic value. As I was saying, I've had the pleasure and the honor of working with the rights of nature for the last 17 years, and I have seen the unprecedented change and growth of this beautiful movement, a movement that is now reaching 40 countries that have advanced the rights of nature and that have made this movement, as Antonio Guterres said, the largest growing legal movement in the world. It is with this context and with this initiative that I am going to give the floor first to Minerva Rosset. So Minerva can give us a brief introduction and welcome to everybody. I would just like to introduce yourself, Minerva. Minerva Rosset, originally from Mexico, has over a decade of experience in natural resource conservation in collaboration with local communities with a vision of environmental changes at the national, regional, and local scale. Minerva is the program manager of Mexico Conservation Funders and special projects at Biodiversity Funders Group. Minerva, it's my pleasure to welcome you and I'm going to give you the floor now.
Thank you, Natalie. Well, it's our pleasure to be part of this webinar. And from Biodiversity Funders Group, as a philanthropic support organization, we promote spaces for collaboration, peer learning, and collective thinking among funders. One of the initiatives that BFG promotes is the Rights of Nature initiative, which seeks to deepen understanding of the movement and contribute to support efforts of organizations advancing conservation and environmental justice around the world. In this case, from BFG, we are pleased to work alongside other funders as Environmental Law, led by Linda Sheehan, and organizations Argonne, led by Natalie, committed to advancing the adoption of rights of nature by communities, governments, and institutions. So as many of the activities that the group of rights of nature inside of BFG is leading, it's a pleasure to have all of you learning more about Cormac and Carola, who will tell us about this initiative. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Minerva. Thank you for all the support. And thank you to the Biodiversity Funders Group for being here and supporting the education that we're bringing through this webinar about what's Antarctica rights and the Antarctic Declaration, the Antarctica Rights Working Group, and everything that we're trying to do to promote that Antarctica has a voice. So that being said, I will start with our first panelist. We have Carola Racket. Carola is a German conservation ecologist, activist, politician, and former ship captain. She was elected to the European Parliament as an independent candidate for the Left Party on June 9, 2024. Raquel participated in several research expeditions to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean and is the co-founder of the Antarctica Rights Initiative. She also supported the Extinction Rebellion movement and took part in the forest protests in Sweden, as well as the occupations of the Hambach Forest and the Danwood Forest in Germany. Between 2016 and 2019, she occasionally volunteered for non-governmental sea rescue organizations in the Mediterranean. In June 2019, she was arrested for docking a migrant rescue vessel without authorization in the port of Lampedusa, Italy. Carola, it's our pleasure to welcome you today, and thank you for sharing your amazing expertise about Antarctica with this webinar today.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I would like to invite everybody before I start to share my screen, because I don't know who the audience is. I don't know if you have been to Antarctica. I myself had the great pleasure to be there during 9 different seasons in the summer and also partly in the winter. I would like to invite you to take a few seconds for yourself to think about Antarctica. Maybe close your eyes, maybe take a deep breath to think what comes up in your mind, in your thoughts, in your feelings when you think about Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And oops. I think for a lot of people, what comes up, it goes into 2 directions. I would say maybe you think of something completely different, but I think for a lot of people, there's the idea of this wilderness, of penguins, probably of the white continent. For a lot of people, I think also, whenever we see something white, we see it's like unspoiled, it's unused, it's kind of clean, it's pristine. And there's a lot of notions around that, and I will set them aside a little. And I think then there are people who are thinking about adventure. You know, they're thinking of the heroic, mostly Western man that sailed to Antarctica and explored. And I think that is very commonly in our imagination what Antarctica is. And I'm not a scientist, but I have been on scientific expeditions as a navigator. And what I have learned from people is that part of our imagination, our perception of Antarctica is not completely true. And I have put this nice Weddell seal here asking us, an unspoiled wilderness, really? Because some of you might know, actually, when I remind you that the Southern Ocean is an ocean that has been historically wrecked by whaling and sealing in the last centuries. And the whole ecosystem that we see today is an ecosystem that is recovering, thankfully, slowly recovering from a massive industrial scale impact of whaling and sealing that has actually not happened to get food for people, it has happened to get fuel. And I think that is something that has wrecked Antarctica in the past. But now our need for fuel for our Western societies has led to the fact that the whole planet, but also Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, are actually facing climate breakdown. And once again, for that need of cheap fuels. And we're at the place where we're sacrificing that ecosystem once again. I would also like to remind people that the biodiversity which is present in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean is mainly marine biodiversity. That's where the true biodiversity hotspots are. And on the shores, there is, of course, terrestrial life, but it's very limited to the to the coast of the continents, and that's also in the same places where tourist vessels are going and where the scientific stations are. So I'm sorry for the screen jumping all the time. I put some liquid over my computer just a few minutes ago, so that's why. The terrestrial biodiversity is really impacted as well by tourism and science competing for the very same spaces. But what I want you to take away is that ecologically speaking, something really amazing is taking place in the Southern Ocean, because when people agreed internationally to stop whaling, whales started to recover. It takes a lot of time. It's going very slowly. They are nowhere near the numbers than they used to be. Seals have partly recovered. Some of them, for example, fur seals in South Georgia, have recovered from just 100 living individuals, which we know because of genetic studies. But the ecosystem is recovering, and there's this amazing possibility for nature to recover if humans stop the harm. And I think that is a core point of what we have to do if Antarctica was again to recover from the damages done in the past. And I would like, after the ecological point, I would like to remind you of some of the things physically that are true about Antarctica and the Southern Ocean as well. It's 10% of the Earth's surface, 90% of the freshwater reserves of all the world. It absorbs 40% of the anthropogenic CO2 emissions and 60 to 90% of excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases. And it is a main driver of the global ocean circulations, because, as you know, all the oceans are connected through the big conveyor belts that are moving the water all around the globe. And one important driver of that is the Southern Ocean, without going into much detail. And oops, I could. And already in the beginning, we have heard about the Antarctic Treaty System. And for those who are not familiar with it, it is the governance system for Antarctica that has come into place sometime during the Cold War. And at that time, it was a tremendous achievement to agree for a peaceful presence of humans in Antarctica, for example, not to have any weapons stationed there, and that was a true achievement. And there are some things about the ATS which are really remarkable. For example, the fact that it has been agreed that decisions are being made by consensus. I will also come to the downsides of that. I have started in the beginning with, a picture of the vessel of Shackleton, because colonial exploration, I think, is so important to understand Antarctica and what it is today, because there are only 29 countries that are allowed to make decisions about Antarctica. And remember, there's roughly 200 in the UN. So it is countries who had the wealth, mostly colonial powers, but not only though, to bring or to create scientific stations in Antarctica, and therefore they gained the right to make decisions about Antarctica, and that remains so until today. And that, of course, is a very elitist club that these nations are part of, and many others cannot participate because they don't have the money to build stations and then get the right to be part of that. So the other issue, which we have very practically in the last years, and something which I should explain before, is that the Antarctic Treaty System covers Antarctica as a continent and the Southern Ocean below 60 degrees, more or less. And it doesn't mean that this whole area is a national park or something to that comparison. It is not a protected area that you might have in your home country. Within Antarctica, there are certain protected areas where fishing, for example, is prohibited, but there are very few. And when we have discussions recently in these spaces where treaty nations meet about, for example, creating more protected areas, there is an impasse, because the nations cannot, the 29 nations have to agree by consensus and they do not agree. In the last decades, they have not agreed on any specific further protection. And even last year, for the first time, they have rolled back on protection because they could not decide together to renew an existing protected area. So that is the state of the ATS, basically, because consensus cannot be found. The system is in a complete impasse. What is also lacking is civil society mostly. There's a couple of NGOs which involve, but we're not in a local space as elsewhere, where a lot of people, indigenous people, locals, have access to participate. It's a very elitist club. And one of the main points which always I like to raise is the fact of climate breakdown, obviously, which is the severest threat affecting Antarctica and the Southern Ocean at this moment. But it cannot be regulated within the ATS because the ATS can only regulate what is happening in Antarctica, but the emissions are, of course, occurring everywhere else on this globe, and of course in the wealthy global North nations. So basically the ATS is not able to address the greatest threat, and that is also why we raised the project of Antarctic rights. And Cormac will explain later how exactly that also helps with the issue of climate change. One important point, of course, is that no one in the current ATS system is advancing Antarctica's own interests. All the nation states are advancing their own interests, but nobody is really looking after Antarctica itself. And that, of course, is a core problem of everything that is happening there. And so for us, coming together as a group for Antarctic rights, there are various things that make it very important to speak up for it. One of it we already explained, the climate stability, the just physical importance of Antarctica for the whole Earth's climate system. The fact that it is a unique ecosystem with an irreplaceable wilderness, but also the fact that Antarctic rights would add a specific innovation that really challenges the paradigm of how we live or see ourselves as humans with nature, and that it would bring something like a completely different viewpoint that could turn around some of the shortcomings of the ATS by actually adding onto it. And I will leave it to Cormac to explain to all of you how exactly that would look like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carola. Thank you for sharing your experience and sharing about Antarctica. I think this was an amazing experience to learn about Antarctica, and a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much for your support and your knowledge. And we will now continue with Cormac Cullinan. So Cormac, welcome to this webinar. I would like to read a bit of your biography. Cormac Cullinan is the director of the Wild Law Institute, as well as the Cullinan Associates Incorporated, a leading environmental law firm in South Africa. He has drafted environmental treaties, laws, policies, and strategies, and advised on institutional reforms in more than 25 countries. Cormac's groundbreaking book, Wild Law, a manifesto for air jurisprudence, pioneered air jurisprudence and helped inspire the growing global rights of nature movement. Cormac led the drafting of the Universal Declaration for the Rights of Mother Earth and was one of the founders of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, GARN, and is the judge of the International Rights of Nature Tribunal. Cormac, it's my pleasure to introduce you today, and we will love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Nachi. I'll just share my slides and we can start. So excuse me for a second while I just get them up.
While you're doing that, Cormac, I just want to remind everyone that you can start putting your questions in the Q&A section, so we can start gathering your questions for the discussion part after Cormac's presentation. Go ahead, Cormac.
Thank you very much. So as you've heard from Carola, Antarctica really is unique. It's absolutely crucial to the regulation of the planet, to a stable climate. And if that ice melts, you get sea level rise of the order of about 60 meters. So it would take a very, very long time for the ice to melt, probably hundreds of years. But that ice sheet on the continent is often 2 kilometers thick. And in the Arctic, the ice is floating on the water, so it's a bit like a cube of ice in your drink. If it melts, your drink doesn't overflow. But most of the ice in Antarctica is on land, so it's like if that slips into the ocean, there's a very, very dramatic increase in sea level rise. So if that were to occur, of course, the world would be completely changed. There'd be no more big cities near the coast like London and New York, and all of those would go. But the real issue is that even though that may take a very long time to happen, the ice has started to melt. And as you know, if you take a cube of ice out of your fridge and you leave it on your kitchen table, once it starts melting, it's very, very difficult to stop. You've got to drop the temperature to basically freezing to stop. And so we really have to protect Antarctica, both for the sake of Antarctica and all the amazing beings that are there, but also for the sake of humanity. So it's incredibly ecologically important. And of course, it's also unique from a governance perspective. But what are the problems? Because you do have this Antarctic Treaty System that Carola spoke about. Well, the first thing is essentially that the Antarctic Treaty System is insufficient to safeguard Antarctica. So it has been and is still a very important system. Without the Antarctic Treaty System, Antarctica would probably be mined already. There would be all kinds of far worse damage. But as you've heard, because the system works on the basis of consensus, it just takes one vote of one country to stop something going ahead. And for example, at the moment, both Russia and Ukraine are members. Many countries are against any further protections. And so really it's completely stuck. At the same time, the threats are increasing. The poles warm faster than most areas on the planet. And so this is growing threat from climate change. Their fishing pressures, increasing pressures to catch krill, some illegal fishing. Also, the increasing tourism has a potential to cause problems. But in essence, you have the main threat, of course, being climate change. So, as Carola has explained, because there are no indigenous people in Antarctica, it means that there's no government. It means that it's not a state. It means that Antarctica has no seat at the table. If it were a state, it would be in the United Nations. It would be at the climate change COPs arguing for its best interests. But instead, it's governed by this group of 29 states we've heard about, all advancing their own needs. And so nobody is at the crucial negotiations advancing the best interests of Antarctica. So what is different about our approach? Well, we believe that you must start by reimagining how humans relate to Antarctica. In other words, we're not just proposing a kind of tweaking or adjustment of an existing system. We're saying that we have to think about Antarctica in a completely different way. And that must be informed by indigenous perspectives, because wherever you go in the world, indigenous people have understood that we humans are just one form of life in an incredible community of life. And that for us to live well in that community, we need to maintain respectful relations with the other members of that community. And if you like, we have to seek to coexist harmoniously within nature, because we're all part of nature. So this is very different from seeing Antarctica as a place to go and stick in a flag and claim a piece of it in a kind of colonial way, or even as a laboratory for science. It's not there for people to, it's not there for our purposes. It's far too wild and fierce for people to govern. It's in a sense, it governs itself, and we need to recognize that. Our approach is also rights-based. If you look at the great social movements that have advanced society throughout the world, most of them have been rights-based. There were people fighting for the abolition of slavery, the abolition of apartheid, people fighting for rights of women, of indigenous people, of children, etc. All these great movements have been around increasing the class of people that hold rights and the rights that they are held. So we think this approach has got a good history of success in the past. It's very much based on putting Antarctica first. In other words, this is about saying we should do what decision-making that affects Antarctica should be based on what's best for Antarctica. We also believe that what's best for Antarctica is ultimately what's best for humanity, because if Antarctica is in good shape, it's much more likely that the planet as a whole will be in good shape. And we humans are like one leaf on this tree of life. If the tree is healthy, we will be healthy. We also see the change being driven primarily by civil society. In other words, within the Antarctic Treaty System, the players are states, a small group of states, and the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, which is a group of NGOs, is allowed to participate as observers, but all the meetings are held behind closed doors. And so civil society and the press are basically excluded from that. So we believe that that system is stuck, as you've heard, and that the drive for change needs to come from outside. And that will be led initially by civil society, but of course we're hoping that many states will also join. Probably states initially that are excluded from the system. For example, in Africa, where I live, only South Africa is part of the Antarctic Treaty System, and none of the other African countries are involved. At one stage, they probably didn't care because they didn't see the relevance of Antarctica, but it's increasingly clear that what happens in Antarctica doesn't stay there. If the ice melts there, the sea level rises around the world. If the current starts slowing down as a result of loss of sea ice, etc., it affects weather throughout the world, and Africa will be affected. So we believe that as this becomes clearer and clearer, you will not only get increasing support from civil society, but also from states. This shift in perspective that I've talked about can be summed up in a way from these words from Thomas Berry, a great, he called himself a theologian, originally a theologian, sorry, and then he changed it to a geologian because as his interest in the world expanded. And he said, the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. So the dominant cultures tend to regard the Earth as a big pile of natural resources which are available for humans to use. But in fact, what holds community ecosystems together and the community of life together is the interrelationship, the communion, if you like, between animate subjects. And so what we're saying is that we need to rethink Antarctica. Antarctica is not just a place, it's a unique living community that's vitally important to all of us. And we need to recognize it as such, because as soon as we recognize that Antarctica is a subject, not an object, then we introduce the question of relationships and appropriate relationship. And we believe that the language of relationships and interrelationships and focusing on that, how we relate to Antarctica, is crucial. So how do we go about doing this? Well, the first thing to do is to come up with a common vision that can unite people. So we've prepared a draft Antarctica Declaration, which is on our website, and which will be negotiated and finalized by the 1st of December 2026, in other words, Antarctica Day next year. So that document sees that would regard Antarctica having a legal status similar to a state and the right to be represented in decision-making that affects it. So when you think of how huge Antarctica is, Carol and I have talked about how important it is to planetary health, but Antarctica and the Southern Ocean covers 10% of the surface of the planet. It's absolutely enormous. The continent alone is bigger than the US and Mexico combined. And for that huge area not to have a voice in decision-making doesn't make sense. The next step is to build an Antarctic alliance around that common vision. So at the moment, we've got an Antarctic working group composed of people from around the world, lawyers, philosophers, scientists, activists. But we want that to be a stronger organization. We want to create an alliance which is strong enough to carry this initiative forward over many years. And so on Antarctica Day this year, the 1st of December, we're going to be launching that alliance and formally launching this campaign and that alliance will finalize, adopt, and implement the declaration. The next step is to develop means of representing Antarctica, because if Antarctica is going to have the status as equivalent or at least equivalent to a state, the question arises, who gets to speak for Antarctica? Who gets to go to international meetings to speak for Antarctica, or perhaps even represent Antarctica in court? Now, that is a question of legitimacy. One has to establish perhaps something like an Antarctic Council or a parliament or some kind of way of choosing the best people, the most competent people who are best able to give expression to what's in Antarctica's best interest. And we've got some ideas about that, but we haven't rushed to a solution because we believe that it's a very important conversation that a lot of people need to be involved in, and that we need to take it very seriously because it will really be breaking new ground. And then another part of how we do this is to connect and build the movement. So we need to build a movement with more and more people behind it, and that will engage with governments, perhaps starting with the more sympathetic ones like small island states, etc. But ultimately, we need a lot of people to come together around this vision in order to drive significant change. And then, of course, campaigning for the recognition and effective implementation of Antarctic rights, because it's one thing recognizing the rights, but how do you implement them? And of course, the most important thing about Antarctic rights is that they create corresponding duties on humans and on states. So the idea really is that if Antarctica has the right to be respected and to continue its vital role in the planet without being unjustly interfered with by humans or damaged by humans, then it means that humans and human organizations like states have duties to Antarctica, which should be legally enforceable. And that will take campaigning for that to be recognized both at the international law level and at national law level. And then one of the things which I think is particularly interesting is that because there are no people indigenous to Antarctica, if we have a way of representing Antarctica in human decision-making, Antarctica will essentially be speaking for nature. It will be a pure voice for nature. And to that extent, it will create a model of how we hear more than human beings and how we prioritize the best interests of the Earth community. In other words, to represent Antarctica in the way we're proposing, we're going to have to learn to listen to pay very close attention to it. And of course, scientists are already very good at doing that, but we will also be bringing in indigenous perspectives. And then we have to find out, we have to develop ways of identifying which is in the best interest of Antarctica. And of course, although we could speak on behalf of Antarctica, we can never truly speak as Antarctica because we aren't Antarctica. So we may never be able to identify with great precision what is precisely the best interest of Antarctica. But certainly I believe that if we're faced with policy choices between choice A and choice B, catching more krill or catching less krill, etc., it won't be too difficult to determine which of those choices is in the interest of Antarctica. So the Antarctic Declaration, I'm not going to go through it here, but just to give you a flavor of it, it defines Antarctica as self-regulating and autonomous. In other words, it's recognizing the reality. As I said before, Antarctica does regulate itself. It's not that it doesn't get affected from the outside, but it is functioning biomes there. And they are autonomous in the sense that we can pretend that the Antarctic Treaty System governs it, but it really just governs people. Antarctica is its own being. It's already beyond national jurisdiction in the sense that it's not owned by any state, and we don't think it should be subject to state sovereignty. We think that the claims which various countries have against them are left over from the colonial era and shouldn't really be entertained in the future. It's not appropriate to divide Antarctica up into bits into territories belonging to distant states. It should be defined as a legal subject with the capacity to hold rights and exercise freedoms. So in many ways, what we really wanted to recognize primarily is Antarctica's right to be free to function as it should function. And that means in many instances, humans should have no right to interfere beyond a certain point. But Antarctica is not just one thing. It's also composed of members who also have legal subjects with rights and freedoms. So, for example, whales or seals or krill, they would also have certain rights under the declaration. Now, one of the very interesting things that happened earlier this month, on July the 3rd, was that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued an advisory opinion. It had been asked to advise on the obligations of states in relation to climate change. And it's a long opinion, but just to pick out a couple of points, they found that all states are bound by the obligation not to cause irreversible damage to the climate and the environment. They called this jus cogens obligation, which basically means that it is binding on states whether or not they've signed a treaty which says this. So most international law is created by countries signing treaties, which are a bit like contracts. It binds the people who sign them. But these kind of obligations bind all states, even if they haven't signed up. So, of course, that is a very sensible thing. And it is the kind of argument that we're making in relation to Antarctica. Antarctica is so central to the health of the planet that every state should have the duty not to cause irreversible harm to it. So that is very much aligned. The court also said that nature itself is capable of holding legal rights. In other words, it shouldn't be just confined to human beings, corporations, and states or juristic persons. And then it spoke specifically about rights of nature, and it said that rights of nature reinforces the protection of the integrity and functionality of ecosystems in the long term, providing effective legal tools to confront the triple planetary crisis and to prevent existential damage before it becomes irreversible. And it strengthens a paradigm focused on protecting the ecological conditions essential for life and empowers local communities and indigenous peoples who have historically served as guardians of ecosystems. So this is very important because what the court is saying is you can't address climate change without safeguarding the ecological conditions essential for life. We only have a stable climate on this planet because life has created it. And if we want to restabilize the climate and move away from climate chaos, we have to protect those conditions that are essential for life. And one of the most important ways of doing that is recognizing that nature has rights, and that we have corresponding duties. Now, I've cited this because it's very recent, and it's an example of what we believe in the Global Alliance is that rights of nature is an idea whose time has come. More than 15 years ago, when we established the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, I remember Nati and I were both there, and many others. We had long discussions about, we believe very strongly in this idea, and we discussed how can we make it an idea whose time has come. But of course, that was 15 years ago, and it's taken a lot of hard work building a movement since then. But suddenly, all over the world, we see amazing initiatives, rights of nature initiatives emerging, some of which are brought about by members of the Global Alliance, but others are just popping up all over as people, as these ideas spread. And this court opinion is particularly important because it is possibly the first explanation or acceptance of the importance of rights of nature at the international law level. And we think that this is a very, very good time to be advancing the Antarctic Rights Initiative. So briefly then looking at some of the strategic considerations which we think are important. One of the reasons why this campaign is so important is because it's globally relevant. Antarctica affects everybody and is everybody's concern. If that ice melts and it has started melting, it's going to affect everybody. It's going to affect the currents, it's going to affect the climate, and it's going to undermine an absolutely unique ecosystem. But because it's not in any particular country, we can mobilize in every country. So we can have campaigns, and we will have a launch all simultaneous launch all around the world to make this point that because of its global relevance, we must be mobilizing in every country. It's also better aligned with the reality of science and wisdom traditions. By that, I mean, ecologists know that you can only understand ecosystems and communities of life by looking at the interrelationships between the different parts. And what we're saying here is we need to recognize that Antarctica is this amazing community of life. And what we need to do is look at how we relate to it and how we interact with it. And particularly, we need to respect Antarctica. And this is aligned. So the approach that we are adopting aligns with ecology and science, but also with the wisdom traditions, which emphasize the importance of seeing the world as alive and of respect and reciprocity, and for humans to take responsibility. Natalia has already referred to the fact that one of the reports of the United Nations Secretary General is that this is the fastest growing legal movement of the 21st century. So we've got wind in our sails, and we believe that that will help carry this forward. And also, of course, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature around the world will also support this initiative, or is supporting this initiative. So what are the next steps? As has been mentioned, in October this year at the IUCN Congress, there will be a debate on a resolution that we've put forward to support this initiative. Then on the 1st of December, which is Antarctica Day, we're going to launch the Antarctic Alliance and this Antarctic Rights Campaign. Although the campaign is, in a sense, already underway, it hasn't been officially launched. So we're hoping that that is going to project it brings movement to the attention of a lot more people around the world. We're then going to work on strengthening that alliance and engaging with governments, and in the course of that year to finalize the Antarctica Declaration. So the members of the Antarctic Alliance will work together to finalize it and polish it. And then a year later, on the 1st of December 2026, we'll have a gathering in Cape Town in South Africa, which is one of the gateway cities to Antarctica, to adopt the declaration. We'll probably do lots of other things like have meetings and perhaps art exhibitions and to raise the profile of Antarctica. And then we'll start working out how to implement the declaration, this various structures, perhaps an Antarctic Council, etc. So as you can see, we're very clear about the way forward over the next while. It's ambitious. It's going to take a lot of work, but we know what we need to do in order to achieve what we've set out to do. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Cormac. And if you can leave your screen there for a little bit so people can see the QR and maybe scan that QR and they can join the Alliance, I will appreciate it, especially as I say, like my last comments before we go to the discussion. I just want to thank you, Cormac, thank you, Carola and Minerva, for your words. I think this has been very inspiring. I have, as I was saying, had the honor of being involved with this movement for the past 17 years, since this was passed in my country, Ecuador, in the Ecuadorian Constitution, and have seen how Ecuador has more than 70 cases. Being able to go to courts and litigate for a little frog is so inspiring, because we had been able to save this amazing cloud forest and these amazing ecosystems by only saying that nature has inherent rights. We are not recognizing rights. We want governments to uphold the inherent rights of nature, understanding that nature is not an object that you exploit, is a subject that you protect. And I think that deep inside, we all understand that we are nature and that we are nature protecting itself. And what else than using the opportunity of the unique governance of Antarctica to make sure that Antarctica has its own voice, and that we can learn that Antarctica has rights, and how will the world look like if we understand that this silent victim is being threatened, and what will she say? I think that Antarctica is a she, so allow me to refer to her as a she. But I would like to go now to the questions. We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to go ahead and read them to you. There are in the Q&A, but I'll read them out loud. Manu Kari says, do we have a sense of what proportion of science undertaken in and around Antarctica is in the service of industry and geopolitics rather than the best interest of Antarctica Southern Ocean ecological communities? Then Manu says, is there any consensus, maybe outside of ATA's members, about which indigenous peoples would have legitimate rights and interests in discussions and decisions about Antarctica? Asking as a Maori person from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Sofia Green says, thank you so much for putting together this amazing webinar. I would like to ask, do you see it possible for the civil society to have a vote in what occurs in Antarctica? How will we be able to change the ATA's 29-country decision-making? Corny Elm says, how are the geopolitical tensions manifesting in Antarctica? Then we have another question that says, please go into further detail about the process of how nations will adopt the declaration so that it will actually be enforceable against all nations. Sanja Rajan says, do you see this as an opportunity for planetary governance, transnational versus global governance, current nation-state based? This switch was mentioned in the book Children of the Modest Start by Niels Gilman, Jonathan Blake. The Berggren Institute may be interested, and here's the link. I may be able to connect the dots if required. And then I'm curious about Arctic versus Antarctica, indigenous people in one and not in another. Could Arctic potentially be a role model for Antarctic? Is there similar Arctic rights being considered? And we also have received some questions via email, so I'm going to pick two of them for our panelists today. One of them says, about inclusive governance, will the declaration encourage broader participation from youth, indigenous thinkers, even outside Antarctica region or civil society in shaping the future governance of Antarctica? And then another one, how might indigenous cosmologies from southern Chile, such as the Kaweskar and Yagan traditions and other indigenous people more broadly, who have talked about their connection with Antarctica, inform the moral narrative around Antarctic rights, even if those communities are not geographically situated there now? So there are quite a few questions here. I open it up not only to Carola, Cormac, Minerva. I know that we have some amazing members of Antarctica Rights Working Group, like Linda is here, and Sila and Ricardo. I see them participating. So if you're welcome to ask me to elevate you as a panelist if you guys want to participate too. But I feel that these are quite a few good examples of questions regarding how do we make this possible. And I think that, Cormac, what you have shared about the advisory decision that we just got, and all the jurisprudence that has been created through countries like Ecuador and other countries like Panama or Bolivia, and like the different ordinances, we have quite a few jurisprudence that allows us to think that it is possible to shift towards the understanding that Antarctica can have its own rights and its own voice. So I would like to open the floor maybe first with you, Carola, so you can start answering some of the questions. Then Cormac, and if Minerva, Linda, Sila, Ricardo, you guys want to chip into any of these answers, just send me a brief message and I will call on you. So let's go with you, Carola.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's great to have so much interest and to have so many also diverse questions. I will try to answer some because I, of course, do not have the knowledge to answer all, but I will just pick a few. And I think one of the first questions, of course, was rightly so about geopolitics and how much of the science is actually be done for possibly geopolitical reasons. To be honest, I do not have a clear answer to that, and I think it doesn't really exist like a clear answer if it's 1%, if it's 5%. It definitely happens that not only some, let's say, scientific journeys are being undertaken for maybe finding some information that can be geopolitically relevant, but I would say even the upkeep of some of the stations generally on the continent is for geopolitical reasons, and it's very openly so. That is the case definitely for the United Kingdom. I've worked for the British Antarctic Survey as well. I can say it's common knowledge that some of the stations do not actually do a great deal of science, but they basically are kept open in the case for the future. There's also always discussions about why China, for example, is building a new station and which country does have how many stations, for example. So there's clear geopolitical interest in that. And I should just say on the side that China at the moment doesn't have any more stations than the US or the UK, for example. But these are discussions or these things which definitely happen. We can also say that Antarctica isn't completely demilitarized. A lot of the South American nations are using military vessels, military personnel to put on their bases. Some of them even bring pregnant women to the Antarctic Peninsula, so they give birth there, so they have like true Antarctic citizens. I think there is a lot of ways that countries also try to raise their stake in owning really a part of Antarctica, but I'm unfortunately not able to say how much of the science has any geopolitical intent. Right, the next question which happened was which indigenous people or communities, for example, could have a more legitimate right to be considered. We have spoken a lot about that in the working group, and I think there's various answers to it. First of all, we think that every community and every person would have the right to speak and to involve and share their knowledge. However, we of course recognize that specific communities, and the Maori are certainly one of them, have oral traditions that show that members of the community have been traveling to the Southern Ocean, that these communities hold knowledge, that they have been involved in past centuries, if not millennia, in sailing to these areas. So they have a very specific and proven relationship. And I think that is not only true of the Maori, but probably also for other communities in the Pacific Ocean who see all the oceans particularly linked and who have oral history potentially of meeting icebergs while people were sailing, etc. But at the same time, as we recognize that, we think everyone really should have the right to speak, because Antarctica concerns everybody, but it's also not, it's just, this is my opinion, and this is not necessarily the opinion of the whole working group. Another person asked about how could the decision about the ATS and the 29 members having so much power, how could that be changed? The unfortunate answer, I mean, there is a possibility for adding new nations to it, but then you would have 30 or 31 nations who cannot agree, and you basically do not really change the concept of it. That would be possible, but basically, if you really fundamentally wanted to change everything or anything, within the ATS, you need consensus. So there are a lot of people who would argue, for example, that the ATS should just change to majority decision-making, for example, right? And for that change to happen, you would need consensus. Like any change requires consensus, also a change of the governance structure. And that is really not going to change very much and not address some of the problems that we have mentioned before are so crucial to what the ecosystem and humanity as a whole is facing. And while that is not an avenue that we are really pursuing, so we're really not trying to change the ATS itself very much, but we're trying to establish something else. I'll have a quick word on just maybe on the Arctic as well. We have been discussing it quite a lot in the working group, that we should connect more with people and communities, indigenous communities, mostly also from the Arctic. We have some little involvement from individuals in this area. I think the huge difference that we mentioned is that in the Arctic, very clearly, there are indigenous communities that have lived there for millennia or longer. Whereas in Antarctica, that is just not the case. So while it is also a polar region, the situation is quite different. And the case of Antarctica is particularly unique in the governance structure and in the fact that there is no human natives to it. I think with that, I probably hand the floor to Cormac and give him the opportunity to add some more.
Thank you, Carola. And Cormac, just to say that there are some more questions coming in the chat, so I will give you the chance to answer some of them. I will then read the rest of the questions, but I also encourage any members of the working group that you can also answer them directly, and we can start a conversation also in the Q&A section. So go ahead, Cormac.
Sure. I think one of the things that I want to communicate is that as you've heard, we think that it's very hard for a significant change to flow through the ATS system. It's a bit like that's a pipe that's blocked. So if I can give an example, in my own country, in the apartheid years, people used to say apartheid is created by laws. They're laws which establish, racially categorize people and give them some people rights and other people deny them rights. And the only way that law can change is through the parliament. And so that means if you want to get rid of apartheid, the change has to come through the parliament. The trouble was that pipe, if I can put it, that pipeline for change was also blocked because only white people had the vote. And so although that was logical, it was never going to happen in that way. And over time, pressure built, and there were activists, for fighting for democracy in South Africa. And eventually what happened was a unique process was created, which went round Parliament, bypassed Parliament, and resulted in a new constitution that brought in a democracy. And I think for me, it's analogous to the situation we have with Antarctica. We can see the pressure building up. We absolutely desperately need very fundamental change. Antarctica is not being sufficiently well protected, and it's going to continue to deteriorate unless we do something very, very significant. So if the change can't come through the ATS, it must come by us moving around the ATS. And that means mobilizing all the people who aren't part of the ATS and bringing it into bringing them into this movement. But it's not just about a new parallel political structure or something like that. It's also about a fundamental difference in thinking. So if we're going to talk about what's in the best interests of Antarctica, this is about Antarctica, not about us primarily. So we've got to get away from thinking about, can we bring in more states, also arguing from their national perspective, as Carola had said, that doesn't change the system fundamentally. And when we're talking about who's entitled to speak for Antarctica, we have to find the people who are best able to articulate what's best for Antarctica, not for themselves or for their countries or for their organizations. And so they need to be people who know about Antarctica, but not only who know intellectually about Antarctica, but who love Antarctica, who really care about Antarctica, and the kinds of people who have the right qualities of selflessness and humility to be good spokespeople for Antarctica. So we're talking about a very, very different kind of politics, if I can put it that way. And so it's a very fundamental shift, and something which I believe can serve as an example for many others. So many of the questions I see are asking about the possibilities for more people to be included in these decision-making processes. And certainly, as I would agree with what Carola has said, we're wanting, if people have got something to offer, regardless of how close or how far they are, they should be able to contribute. And obviously one of the most important contributions of Indigenous people is that these are cultures that knew how to survive over millennia without degrading their habitats. And those are cultures the dominant cultures have a lot to learn from. And so their contributions are going to be particularly important. So I think it's a very interesting thing, because it's, in a way, it's not engaging in the traditional debates as to which political bloc should predominate. It's saying we don't even want to play that game. we don't want to argue about who get into some arm wrestle between countries. It's not about which of you guys wins. It's about Antarctica winning. So it's very important that that we appreciate that this is not just shifting around the deck chairs on the Titanic, or changing things within the existing system. We're talking about a very, very different approach to the whole thing. And so I see there are lots of questions coming in here. But I think, I hope that gives you some sense of what we're trying to do. It's about innovating so that we can begin to build a system which will govern people so that we behave as good citizens of this Earth community, and we abandon this doomed project of trying to be colonists over the whole globe, and act as if we are separate from and superior to nature. So we believe that sort of colonial attitude to the community of life can never work, and we need to have this fundamental reorientation that is implicit in this approach. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Cormac. And Carola, before I give the floor to you, I'm just going to read like a couple more questions that are here to see if when I give you back the floor, you can answer some of these. So we have, do you think some of the claimant states will accept to renounce to their claims for the rights of Antarctica? I think that Cormac was talking about that already. How could academia be included in Antarctica rights movement? I think this is an important point about how the group is being conformed. Then it says, if Ricardo says, if countries, people are the problem, why will having more countries at the Antarctic table be in the best interest of Antarctica? Then we have more questions here. I was at Global Tipping Points Conference in Exeter, where changes to Antarctica were mentioned, including change in feedback loops, such as between layers of water, fresh water at top, salt water below, that is farther melting in Antarctica. This likely ties to what Manu Kari asked. Having the Earth Commission, Postman Institute would again be the key to further taking planetary governance versus a global governance, nation-state based. So he's just thinking outside the ATS as an imperative. And related to that, he says the last slide shown at the conference was that we have reached a social tipping point, rights of nature and Earth law. Sorry to verbose here. And we have some answers being typed here. So let me go back to you, Carola, to answer some of these questions and maybe further what Cormac has been sharing as well. Go ahead, Carola.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to, I don't know, add something small because I now remembered that somebody was asking also particularly about indigenous communities who are living in what we now refer to as Patagonia or Tierra del Fuego, Kawesca and Yagan communities, but also goes back to the question about indigenous communities in the Arctic that we could engage with. And I think I just wanted to say that within the working group from the beginning, like just 4 years ago, I think we have been speaking a lot about how we could meaningfully include indigenous communities. And we have recently had a meeting where we realized that for making meaningful connections and really involving people to participate, not only with a one-time opinion, but really feel as part of the process, we should actually need to travel and speak to communities where they are and, really have the time for deeper conversations and talking to them to possibly create the trust to collaborate. But our working group thankfully has existed over the time with very limited funding, and people are mostly volunteering their time. There's basically nobody here in the group which is paid. So I think a question of meaningfully including people has been a lack of possibility to really meet them with time to have a deeper conversation. It's something that we are very aware of and that we would love to do, but so far haven't figured out how we could do it, because we also recognize that in international spaces it's only a certain people who have the possibility, the time, the money, the energy, the connections to travel there. And sometimes if you want more involvement, you have to actually go and meet people where they are. But for me personally, I would love to involve these communities, and so would pretty much I think everyone else in the working group, if we could get that opportunity to make it happen and involve them in the long term also.
Thank you, Carol. I think that's really important, and I think that we also have some people interested, hopefully, in funding in the Antarctic working group, the Antarctic Rights Working Group, and making this bigger. I think that, of course, bringing more funds into this alliance will strengthen the possibilities of what can happen. So, Cormac, I will also like to understand, or get people here to understand, because we have also invited quite a few people that are involved with IUCN, and that, considering that the IUCN World Conservation Congress is coming up in October, can you share more additional information? I know you have already done a little bit, but regarding especially motion 055, and what can members and non-IUCN members learn and do in the process, and what are the next steps in this process? So this can also help as an educational tool to either people that are involved with IUCN or are close to IUCN members.
I think Linda is probably in a better position to answer that than I am, but I'm not sure if you're in a place where you can speak, Linda. Do you want to take the question?
Sure, I could take it. Hi, thanks so much. And thanks for the wonderful presentations and the amazing questions that are coming in. Just super thoughtful and a lot to think about and discuss there. Just very quickly, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the world's largest environmental science, advocacy, civil society group in the world, I believe, with thousands of members, meets every 4 years. And this is one of those years. They'll be meeting in the fall. And IUCN members, nation states, and other groups around the world can propose motions for consideration. Back in 2012, a motion was proposed to have the IUCN recognize and work towards more formal recognition through a declaration of the rights of nature. And so that was approved back in 2012. And there have been various initiatives since, through work planning and other activities at the IUCN in 2016 in Hawaii, and then in 2020/21 in Marseille. So this fall, the IUCN will be meeting again. And one of the motions that's been proposed by Wilderness Foundation Africa is recognition of the rights of Antarctica. The motion number is 055. That's what Natty mentioned, but it's a recognition of the rights of Antarctica and movement in that direction. So there will be discussion at the Congress in the fall, and only IUCN members, which includes nation states, but many other organizations, including environmental nonprofit groups and many others, and universities, et cetera. Only those members can vote, but there's quite a few of those members. And if folks are interested, if they're a member and they're interested in learning more, they could, contact anyone in this group, especially Carola and Cormac, and many others who are part of the Antarctic Rights Working Group. And that's the website has a list of the folks that are on that working group, if you happen to know any of us and want to reach out. And then also, if you're not an IUCN member or you don't intend on going, but you're very interested, you can reach out to people who are IUCN members, and if you're friends with them or collaborate with them, and just mention that it's something that's important to you, and happy to talk about it further. So I can put a couple of links in the chat that could provide more information, but that's something that will be a good discussion that we're having this fall.
Thank you, Linda, for that. And then I can, that's really, really helpful. And please do follow the social media of Antarctica Rights, so you can learn more about the motion and see how to support. And Cormac, Carola, I would like to get back to you regarding maybe the need for funding, like what's needed to grow this movement and the call. There were some questions regarding how do we reach governments, like how is this declaration, maybe it's going to reach civil society, but how do we reach governments to be trying to change this? And in the questions that were sent to us, there was quite a specific question regarding the involvement of countries that have like a direct link with Antarctica, like Chile or New Zealand, for example. And if the Antarctica Working Group is trying to do something regarding those countries that have a direct link to Antarctica. Cormac?
Thanks, Nati. Yes, as Carola mentioned, we started this initiative with virtually no money, I think, and it was most people are volunteering their time. And what we found out is that this initiative has accelerated far faster than starting the Rights of Nature. For those of us who were around, sort of 15, 20 years ago, it was really hard work in the beginning. People thought we were crazy and didn't understand it, etc. And this is something which we really only started talking about early 2021, and it went, public later than that. And there's been a very rapid uptake, particularly in academia. So in December last year, there was a whole special edition of the Polar Journal devoted entirely to Antarctic rights. And there's a lot of discussion about, there's a lot of interest. And I think it's because, as somebody mentioned in the chat, there's a kind of a tipping point has passed, and people really are beginning to understand rights of nature and the importance of it. And also Antarctica, there's no doubt in my mind that people are beginning to realize just how important Antarctica is. So the thing is now this initiative is running away from us, and we've got to run to catch up with it. And it's going to take, we need resources so that we can have a global launch, 1st of December, which is not far away. And then a year later, we want to convene a big gathering in Cape Town, and that will also take money, and it's also very ambitious. But we really want to keep up the momentum, and so we desperately need resources for those two things and various other activities that we're planning as well. But it's exciting to see it. So in many ways, we are just trusting that we will get supported, and we're just going ahead. But it's very much in our minds to be looking for that kind of support. And then just to touch on the question of states, of course, it's difficult for states are designed to advance their own interests. It's very difficult for states to sort of think out of that box. But as people have alluded to in the chats, we do need to be, if we're going to look after this planet, we do need to begin to think differently. Although, as Ricardo mentioned in the chat, it's not so, we're not wanting more and more states to join the Antarctic Treaty System just because we don't think that will necessarily help. But states are a reality in the world. And if Antarctica is going to be accepted as something like the equivalent of the states, it needs to be accepted by other states. And they, if you think about how a new state happens, a group of people come together and they say, we want to be a state. And other countries probably initially say, no, well, we don't know who you are, we don't care. But over time, if enough countries recognize them and say, okay, we'll accept that you're a state, they are a state. And so that's the kind of process we need. We need states to support that, and also to push this idea and to put resources in, etc. Because at the end of the day, of course, even if Antarctica is a state or a legal person, it will still need protection in the form of like physical ships, etc., to stop people catching krill or whaling, etc. So you will need the support of states. But the key thing is we're not necessarily just going through that paradigm. We're trying to approach it out of the box, and as we've said, by putting the rights of Antarctica front and center.
Thank you, Cormac. And we have 10 more minutes to go. So I'm going to ask Carola if you want to give any final comments, close with any answer to any of these questions that have also been raised. Cormac, there's also another question for you, so I'll read it to you before I give you the floor for your last comments. Carola?
Well, yeah, first of all, I would really like to thank the audience for all these amazing questions. And because they're a very diverse range, and also for the interest, I think it's really, really nice that so many people are interested. I think I would like to add just a small point, which I forgot to mention, is one of the more practical questions about somebody had asked, about the conflation of industry and science and all these things. And I think we have spoken about one industrial activity which is taking place in Antarctica, that is tourism, and is massively growing. Another activity is fishing for krill, tiny crustaceans, which are the base of the whole food web for Antarctica. And the fishing is, I think sometimes in the 70s, the Soviet Union actually fished for krill for human consumption, but that is today not the case anymore. The krill that is being fished massively also by Norway, which has the most advanced vessels, but also by other countries, is being used for health supplements, omega-3 products that are being fed to not only to humans, but also to your pets, like cats and dogs, and really used for really, in my eyes, completely nonsensical purposes. But the issue which arises here is that generally we know that Antarctica is under very heavy ecological threats. At the same time as the money for science and for real scientific investigation is being reduced. So the monitoring network in Antarctica, for example, about the krill populations is actually getting less every year, and a lot of countries are not doing that basic monitoring science anymore, or to a much lesser degree than they used in the past. This has led to the fact that scientists are cooperating with the krill fishing vessels, particularly with the Norwegian fleet, Aker Biomarine, which is inviting scientists to come on board the vessels and do krill science on board the industry vessels. And that, I think, is largely problematic. But basically what we would need, to end on a slightly more positive note here, we would need monitoring about the health condition of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean that is financed not by individual nation states, but for which there was somehow funding that has been given globally. Because we obviously need scientific monitoring to understand what the health of the ecosystem is. But at the moment, that monitoring is not being prioritized by the states, because the funding for science is being reduced in most countries, at least. And that is deeply problematic. So yeah, a lot needs to change very fundamentally for Antarctica to be able to be healthy and hopefully recover from the previous human impacts. So yeah, with that, I would like to say thank you from my side to everyone who has been listening. And if you have further questions, you can always email to us, of course, if you come up with questions.
Thank you, Carola. A lot is happening and everything is quite urgent. So we need to take urgent calls, and this is like a bold initiative. So I think that this comes in the right moment. Cormac, we have two more questions, very short. One of them you have just answered, so thank you. It was about the process of how nations will adopt the declaration. Just so we'll get on record, I will just read your answer really fast, Cormac. So it says, please go into further detail about the process of how nations will adopt the declaration so it will actually be enforceable against all nations. Enforceability of rights of nature has hit and miss record depending upon many factors. And Cormac says, once we have finalized the declaration, December 1st, 2026, we will open it for signature by both civil society and states. However, we know that this is a long-term initiative and it will take time to achieve enough support. However, we are encouraged by how quickly the idea of the rights of nature has moved from crazy to being recommended by international courts. So thank you, Cormac, for that answer. And then there's a last question that says, is there currently any cooperation dialogue between the Antarctic Rights Movement and the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources? So if you want to answer that before we start closing the webinar, and any final comments, Cormac?
Sure. There isn't currently any dialogue, and that's mainly because this is really at early stage. We're still trying to launch the Antarctic Alliance, which will then establish, a strong coordinating committee, which will then be able to reach out and start these kind of dialogues. So it's still, this is a very young movement, but I hope we've managed to convey that I think that it's a sufficiently bold and big and new idea to match what the times require. This is a time the planet and humanity are in trouble, and it's no time for fiddling at the margins. It's time for decisive change. And what we're proposing here is bigger than establishing a new state for the first time. It's something much bigger, and it's not just something within the framework. It would be a completely unique being at the international law level. We're doing something that has never been done before, and so we're going to get some things wrong. It's exploratory, but we believe that changing how people relate to Antarctica so that every person on the planet understands that they have a duty to protect Antarctica, and that duty, in a sense, they owe to Mother Earth, is very fundamental. It's not just about changing law, it's about changing worldviews, and ultimately it's part of the change that we need. I believe we need if humanity are going to continue to flourish on this planet. We need to have the humility to accept that we are members of this incredible community of life to which we have a great responsibility, and we need to act accordingly and begin to redesign our governance systems and laws to reflect that. So I think it's very bold, it's very big, it's very long term, and it's very exciting. But it could make a real difference. And so I hope that all of you are going to support it in whatever ways you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Cormac. Thank you, Carola. And I'm so happy and honored to be engaged in this trip together, this long-term dream that we're going to make it happen. So Minerva, do you want to close us with some closing comments and maybe a goodbye for the session?
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, definitely. We appreciate the time that all of you spend with us, learning more about the big opportunity that we have to protect the rights of the Antarctica from different perspectives, from the scientific, from the legal, from the governance. And well, especially thank you, Cormac and Carola, and also Linda for being here, sharing with us like these different moments that takes a lot of relevance, thinking also on these next steps that Cormac shared with us. So also, thank you, Natalia, and all the GORN team that were putting together and taking the lead to make this possible, to have this engaging conversation that hopefully it will continue growing through the months until we get to these important moments that Cormac shared with us, like the IUCN meeting and the moment when the declaration is launched and we could make it happen. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Minerva. Thank you, Carola. Thank you, Cormac, Linda, to all the GORN team. It's been my pleasure to be facilitating this dialogue. It's my pleasure to see how this movement grew from an idea that was, we were said to be crazy, to, as you say, Cormac, something that is quoted and recommended. In the academic sector, like when we were working with the Rights of Nature movement in Ecuador, we almost maybe found like 3 to 5 articles. Of course, your book, Cormac, about wild law and the rights of nature, and now you can find more than 18,000 entries when you look for rights of nature. So it's amazing how this movement has grown up to 40 countries right now, and it's gonna keep on growing because it's the time to listen to nature very closely, because she is talking, and we need to not only listen to her, but give her a voice. So this is an amazing opportunity to work for Antarctic rights, and we give all our support to the Antarctic Rights Working Group, to the launch of the Alliance, and we really encourage you to follow the social media of Antarctic Rights for this campaign, to share the word, to share what's going to happen with IUCN Congress and the motions, not only the one for Antarctica, there are quite a few motions talking about the rights of nature, and to keep growing and becoming part of this big movement to give nature a voice, because we are nature protecting itself. So thank you so much for your time. And with this, I would like to close this webinar. Of course, thanking everybody who was able to participate here. And we will have this recording also ready for you to share with anybody who missed today's opportunity to learn about Antarctica rights. So thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, a good night, and maybe a good morning somewhere around the world. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.